The Niger Delta, a region celebrated for its vibrant culture, resilient people, and abundant natural beauty. Nestled within this rich landscape is Akwa Ibom, a land with a deep and fascinating history that has shaped its identity through both challenges and triumphs. From the bustling trade routes of the past to the thriving communities of today, Akwa Ibom has always been a pivotal player in the story of Nigeria. During the transatlantic slave trade and later as colonial influences swept across the land, she served as the unifying point of the southern and northern protectorate of colonial Nigeria. In this documentary, we journey through the significance of the Niger Delta during the slave trade and colonial era of Nigeria, explore the relics of a forgotten past, and visit the sites that hold the echoes of history. We uncover how Akwa Ibom's role in these periods of history still reverberates in the collective memory of its people and in the land itself. This is the Niger Delta story, a testament to legacy.
Niger Delta had always been, a place to reckon with as far as the institution of transatlantic slave trade and slavery was called to question. So right from that period on, and you know that for slaves, the basic slaves that were extracted from this part of the world were not the elderly people. They were young, virile, and vibrant people of adolescence and the middle age, in order for them to supply the much required human labor in the plantations, at the plantations in the Americas, So America, to a very large extent, especially southern part of maybe South Carolina, all this southern part of the US and the Caribbean, couldn't have gone to that level, their level of development, but for, couldn't have done that, but for the supply of human labor to them that eventually made them to become rich. Remember, sugar cane was the basic product. Coffee and tea. You understand? These were basic ingredients of European food. So it was the labor of people from the Niger Delta area that gave impetus to development in the Americas and of course in Europe. So when you talk about the significance of slave trade in the Niger Delta, yes, we actually contributed a great deal to the development of the Americas and Europe. Slave trade at the instance of the Europeans eventually commoditized human beings, especially Calabar people. That explains why, if you go to Brazil, people are still playing Igbo, which was actually taken away as a result of these people that were extrapolated from here as slaves to Brazil. The whole of Caribbean, people that are populated by a lot of people that came from this part of extraction. In Cuba, they play Ikpe, which they call Abakwa, and in Jamaica, they still have some people call Abasi, Obasi. Ubok is Ubok, Ukut is Ukut, which is the leg, So it means that those persons, came from this part of the world up initially, with the wealth that was generated by Africans in the Americas and of course in Europe. The Europeans, especially Britain, which was an ardent prosecutor of slave trade and slavery in the Americas, or what you call the transatlantic slave trade, right, became so very vibrant enough to inaugurate the Industrial Revolution And those industrial machines were basically insatiable because they were always looking for, raw materials, in order to engage in a production. A typical machine has to function with what? A lubricant. Apart from that, it can never function. So palm oil became very, very vital for industrial Europe. Now, because these things were available in the Niger Delta region, it became contingent on the Europeans to make sure that they had access to where this basic ingredient could be got, in abundance. And that brought about what? Imperialism. Remember in 1885, you had the Berlin Conference, right? It was basically where the Europeans or European powers decided to dissect Africa into their spheres of influence, or influences as the case may be, And with that, the so-called Bible and the plow Christianity of Thomas Buxton, came into play, because they said you conquer the people, bring them to the knowledge of what? God, in parentheses, as if Africans did not know God before. The Niger Delta region now became source of raw materials for the industrial machines in Europe. Little wonder then why the area became known as the Oil Rivers Protectorate. And that of course explains why you had a lot of companies, European companies, that were established in this part of the world. You had the ACOA, you had the GB Ollivant, you had John Holt, you had the Messrs. Shepherd, you had African Nuts, you had MacIver, and so on and so forth. Especially in this part of the world, Akwa Ibom, in Akwa Ibom, basically. Remember, old Calabar, Akwa Ibom was actually, reckoned to be part and parcel of old Calabar, because most of the oil palm oil that was sold, at old Calabar came from the Bibu hinterland in present day Akwa Ibom State. So much so that Ikpa, you have Ikpa road, became very prominent in the so-called legitimate trade era. There were a lot of inland ports, such as Wangiba, such as Opobo, such as Ibawa, such as Etemekpo, such as Oborokara. All those inland ports were established to ensure the evacuation of palm produce from the area. The Niger Delta region of Nigeria took charge of what? Slave trade. It also took charge of what? The so-called legitimate trade. The success of the Arrow expedition, as I said ab initio, which took place in 1901 and 1902, right? Akwa Ibom area became pacificated, right, by the British. By pacification, I mean conquest of the entire Akwa Ibom land, right? And in any event, it was done piecemeal. Several persons were involved in the pacification of Akwa Ibom area. Somebody like Brooks, Major Brooks. That's why you have Brooks Street here. Several persons did well, blah, blah, I take it too. There were several columns that moved in and mopped up pockets of resistance of Akwa Ibom people against British imperialism. Now, but the fact that by 1900, colonialism had begun to be forcefully entrenched in the Bibi land, to such an extent that the area became totally conquered, so to speak, because the area was brought into the orbit of colonialism at the instance of the British. the Amalgamation Treaty or Act was signed at Ikorabasi by Lord Lugard, who became the Governor General of Nigeria following the amalgamation. 1914, that was when the Amalgamation Act was signed by Lord Lugard. The Women's War actually started in in fact, the prelude to it was the attempts by Graham Thompson. Remember, after the First World War, which ended in 1918, right? The British colonial force had thinned down a great deal. They did not have money to prosecute the colonial state again, to such an extent that they mooted the idea of what? Taxing people. So in 1927, a certain Graham Thompson now insisted on conducting a head count of peoples in Eastern region, so to speak, and women were counted to such an extent that even stands of cassava owned by women, household utensils were also counted. Do you understand? That were owned by the women. So the men now, in concert with the women, because it now became apparent that the women were about being taxed. It was done in concert with the men, who now, instigated the women to engage in that protest. And the basic place that war, so-called women's war, should be named after should be Ikorabasi, not Aba. But because Aba was a colonial district, so to speak, the town, the whole of this area was under the jurisdiction of Aba. That's why they called it Aba Women's War. Rather, it should be Ikorabasi, Women's War. And that was where the mother of late Justice Roma was killed, because she was also the leader of the protest in Ikorabasi. And after the protest, after that protest, it became apparent to the colonial masters that taxation was not going to be, a given fact in their enterprise. So that actually made them to change their attitude towards the system of governance in Nigeria, and that was when the native authority, the system was actually brought to being, right, in the whole of Eastern Nigeria. So that women's war, which became prominent, was at Ikorabasi, and that was also where the largest number of casualties, years was recorded. It was at Ikorabasi. So that area, Akwa Ibom area, Ibibio land, basically has been contributing right from time. In fact, from the era of slave trade, to the growth and development of the Europeans, and at during the time of imperialism, and of course during the time of colonialism, the area has always been, contributing largely to the colonial enterprise, and of course to the colonial state called Nigeria.